Welcome to Life Stories, where we share powerful journeys of resilience, inspiration, and transformation. Today's story is about Sophia, a young girl from Springfield whose determination and brilliance helped her overcome incredible challenges. From a chaotic home life to becoming the founder of a groundbreaking education program, Sophia's journey shows us how belief, mentorship, and hard work can turn dreams into reality. Join us as we explore her extraordinary path and the profound lessons she learned along the way. Subscribe to Life Stories to begin today's inspiring tale. Let's dive in. I met Sophia when she was just 10 years old. Even then, her sharp brown eyes carried a quiet intensity, a depth far beyond her years. She lived in Springfield, a small town where life was predictable for most. But for Sophia, home was anything but stable. Her world was one of contradictions, a place where chaos reigned. Yet her mind sought order through numbers and equations. I remember the first time I saw her, hunched over a scuffed kitchen table, her messy auburn hair falling across her face. A battered notebook lay open in front of her, the pages covered in precise pencil marks. She was working on a math problem, her lips moving silently as if she were whispering secrets to the numbers. There was something captivating about the way she held her pencil, as though every line she drew was laying the foundation for a better future. For Sophia, math wasn't just a subject, it was a lifeline. Outside, the winter wind howled, but inside her small home, it was another kind of storm that rattled the walls. The sharp slam of the front door jolted Sophia from her thoughts. Her father's voice boomed through the house, cutting the air like a knife. "You always have to be right, don't you? Always finding a way to criticize everything," he shouted. His anger was raw, the kind that built over years of frustration and regret. Her mother's voice followed, just as fiery. "And you? Have you ever thought about what you're destroying?" It was a cruel dance, one Sophia knew all too well. The arguments were as predictable as the seasons, yet they never lost their sting. Sophia's grip on her pencil tightened. Her small hands trembled. But she forced herself to focus on the numbers in front of her, as if they could shield her from the storm raging just a few feet away. The sound of her parents' voices faded into the background as she clung to the math problem like a lifeboat. Then came the inevitable command. "Sophia, go to your room," her mother yelled, her voice cracking with the strain of anger. Sophia hesitated, her eyes lifting slowly from the notebook. "But I just wanted to finish this," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "Now, Sophia," her father barked, his exhaustion written across his face. Sophia didn't argue. She closed her notebook with a quiet sigh, picking it up along with her pencil. Her head bowed. She walked to her room, the weight of an invisible burden pressing down on her small frame. Her room was as modest as the rest of the house. The walls were painted a pale blue, long faded to a dull gray. A narrow window let in a sliver of light, illuminating the shelves she had fashioned out of old planks and stacked with second-hand books. Sophia sat on the floor, crossing her legs as she reopened her notebook. "One day, all of this will change," she whispered to herself. Her voice was steady, a stark contrast to the chaos outside. She spoke not to convince herself but to affirm what she already knew deep down. For Sophia, math was more than a subject at school. It was a place where everything made sense, where problems had solutions and rules weren't bent by emotions or circumstance. She scribbled equations furiously, each solved problem bringing a flicker of peace to her tumultuous world. As the night wore on, the house grew quieter. The echo of her parents' voices faded, replaced by the creak of the old floorboards and the steady scratch of Sophia's pencil. It was during these hours, alone with her thoughts, that she found the clarity to dream. She didn't just study math to escape, she studied because she believed it was her way out. If she could excel, if she could master these numbers and formulas, she could build a life far removed from the shouting matches and shattered hopes of her childhood. Later that evening, there was a soft knock at her door. Sophia froze. Her pencil hovering above the paper. The door creaked open, revealing her mother's face. Her eyes were swollen, her features etched with guilt. "Is everything okay in here?" her mother asked, her voice low and strained. Sophia shrugged, not looking up. "I'm studying. That's all." Her mother lingered for a moment, as if searching for the right words to say, but none came. She sighed and quietly closed the door, leaving Sophia alone once more. That night, as Sophia worked late into the hours when other children would have long been asleep, she made herself a promise. "I will get out of here. I'll be more than this." It wasn't just a fleeting thought. It was a vow, one etched into her very being. Sophia believed that through sheer willpower and relentless effort, she could change her destiny. She didn't dream of wealth or fame, she simply wanted freedom, the kind that came with knowledge and independence. School was the one place where she felt most alive. In the classroom, Sophia's passion for learning burned brightly. She absorbed every lesson with an intensity that set her apart from her peers. She was always seated in the second row, close enough to focus but not so close as to draw too much attention. Her hand shot up to answer questions before most students had even processed them. Teachers noticed her brilliance, but to her classmates, she was simply the quiet girl with the worn-out notebooks and unshakable focus. Math class was her favorite. It was there that she felt connected to a world where logic reigned and emotions didn't blur the lines. But it was also where she faced her first real challenge, the sharp authority of Mrs. Walker, a teacher who demanded respect and rarely gave praise. Sophia admired her teacher's command of the subject but was unprepared for the tension that would soon define their relationship. For now, though, Sophia was content to lose herself in the orderly world of numbers and equations. Each solved problem was a step closer to her dream, a small but vital victory in her battle against the chaos of her life. And as she sat in the quiet of her room, pencil in hand and determination in her heart, Sophia knew she was building something far greater than solutions on paper. She was building a future. Sophia's mornings at Springfield Elementary followed a routine she clung to with quiet determination. Each day began with the hurried sound of her worn sneakers scuffing against the pavement as she made her way to the small school building. For most students, the day was filled with chatter and carefree moments. For Sophia, it was a battlefield, though not one defined by fights or harsh words. Her battle was internal, against doubt, fear, and the weight of her family's turmoil. Her favorite part of the day was math class. Numbers were reliable, they didn't shift or scream. They held a logic she could rely on, a constant in a world that felt otherwise chaotic. Mrs. Walker, the math teacher, stood at the front of the room like a fortress, tall and commanding, with sharp features and a no-nonsense demeanor. She demanded precision and discipline. To many students, she was intimidating. But to Sophia, at least initially, she was inspiring. Sophia always sat in the second row, her battered notebook open and her pencil poised, ready to absorb every detail. On this particular day, the lesson was on fractions. Mrs. Walker moved across the board with quick, confident strokes of chalk, her voice slicing through the murmurs of the classroom. "And so, by multiplying the numerator and denominator, we simplify this fraction into..." Mrs. Walker paused, stepping back to admire her work. Sophia, however, felt a strange unease. Her sharp mind had already dissected the problem, and she noticed something was off. Her hand wavered slightly as she raised it. "Excuse me, Mrs. Walker," Sophia said, her voice steady but quiet. "I think the variable should be in the numerator, not the denominator." The classroom stilled. Heads turned, and a hushed tension filled the air. Mrs. Walker froze mid-step, her chalk hovering in the air. Slowly, she turned toward Sophia, her expression unreadable. "You think you know more than I do, Sophia?" Mrs. Walker's tone carried an edge, a mixture of sarcasm and challenge. Sophia blinked. surprised by the intensity of the response. "No," she replied, her voice respectful but firm. "I just thought there might be a mistake." Mrs. Walker's lips pressed into a thin line. "A mistake," she repeated, setting the chalk down with deliberate precision. "Let me explain something to you. Young lady, I've been teaching this subject longer than you've been alive. If there's a mistake, it's not yours to correct." The words landed like blows. Sophia's cheeks flushed, but she refused to lower her gaze. "Understood," she said, her voice steady even as her hands trembled. "Good," Mrs. Walker replied curtly, turning back to the board. "Now, let's continue." Sophia lowered her eyes to her notebook, pretending to take notes as the rest of the lesson carried on. Her mind, usually so focused, buzzed with a mixture of confusion and frustration. She hadn't meant to challenge Mrs. Walker's authority. She had only wanted to help. And yet, her honesty had been met with hostility. When the lesson ended, Sophia stayed behind, her movements slow and deliberate as she packed her things. She could feel her classmates' curious glances, their whispered comments. Mrs. Walker stood at the front of the room, erasing the board with quick, sharp motions, not even sparing a glance at Sophia. The following days brought no relief. Though Sophia continued to excel, she couldn't shake the tension between her and Mrs. Walker. The teacher's sharp gaze seemed to linger on her longer, her tone more pointed whenever she addressed her. Sophia buried herself deeper in her studies, determined not to let the conflict deter her. But Mrs. Walker wasn't done. One afternoon, as the students worked quietly on an assignment, she approached Sophia's desk and placed a single sheet of paper in front of her. "This is a problem I've written specifically for you," Mrs. Walker said, her voice low but firm. "If you're so confident in correcting me, let's see how well you do with this." Sophia stared at the equation. It was far more complex than anything they'd covered in class, a problem clearly meant to test, and perhaps embarrass. Ha! Her heart pounded as she picked up her pencil, every nerve in her body telling her to retreat. But she didn't. With a deep breath, Sophia began working through the problem. The room seemed to disappear as she focused, her pencil moving steadily across the page. She could feel Mrs. Walker's gaze burning into her, but she refused to let it break her concentration. Minutes passed. When she finally set her pencil down, she looked up at Mrs. Walker and said, "It's solved." Mrs. Walker took the paper, her expression unreadable as she scanned Sophia's work. The silence in the room was deafening, every student watching the exchange with wide eyes. When Mrs. Walker finally looked up, her face was tight, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Correct," she said simply, placing the paper back on Sophia's desk. Without another word, she walked away. Sophia's classmates exchanged stunned glances, a few whispering quietly among themselves. But Sophia didn't revel in the moment. She simply returned to her notebook, her heart heavy despite the victory. She hadn't solved the problem to prove a point, she had done it because she couldn't ignore a challenge. Yet it felt as though the gap between her and Mrs. Walker had only grown wider. That evening, as Sophia sat in her room, the encounter played over and over in her mind. For the first time, she questioned whether her intelligence was a gift or a burden. All she wanted was to understand and be understood. Instead, she had become a target for resentment. Still, as she stared at her notebook, the faint whisper of her dreams pushed through the doubt. "I will get out of here," she whispered to herself again. The words were a lifeline, pulling her back to the promise she had made. No matter the obstacles, Sophia would not let her circumstances or anyone dim her light. The aftermath of that tense afternoon lingered in the air like a heavy fog. Sophia, though composed on the surface, carried the weight of her interaction with Mrs. Walker. She kept her focus sharp in class, her notebook always open, her pencil poised to capture every detail. But something had shifted. The classroom, once her sanctuary, now felt like a minefield. Mrs. Walker, too, was unsettled. Though her demeanor remained as strict as ever, there was a hint of hesitation in her interactions with Sophia. The teacher, who prided herself on precision and authority, found herself replaying the events of that day. Each time, the memory gnawed at her, leaving an unspoken discomfort. Sophia's quiet strength, her ability to solve the seemingly insurmountable problem, had challenged Mrs. Walker's view of herself not just as a teacher but as a person. One evening, long after the students had gone home, Mrs. Walker remained in the empty classroom. The faint hum of fluorescent lights filled the space as she stood before the chalkboard. In her hand, she held a piece of chalk, but she wasn't writing. Instead, she stared at the faint remnants of equations that had been wiped away earlier in the day. Her thoughts wandered back to Sophia, to the precision with which the young girl had solved the problem. It wasn't just the solution that lingered in Mrs. Walker's mind, it was the look in Sophia's eyes. It wasn't defiance or arrogance, it was conviction. The girl had not challenged her out of pride but out of a genuine pursuit of truth. Mrs. Walker sighed and set the chalk down. She moved to her desk, where a stack of papers awaited her attention. But she couldn't bring herself to focus. For the first time in years, she questioned whether her rigid approach to teaching had stifled rather than inspired. The next day, Mrs. Walker entered the classroom earlier than usual. The morning sunlight poured through the windows, illuminating the room with a warmth that felt almost foreign. She scanned the rows of empty desks, her gaze settling on the second row, where Sophia always sat. A part of her dreaded their next encounter, yet another part of her felt something deeper, a need to make things right. When the bell rang, students began filing in, their chatter filling the room with life. Sophia entered quietly, as she always did, her notebook clutched tightly to her chest. She took her usual seat without looking at Mrs. Walker, her expression calm but distant. The lesson began, and the class settled into its rhythm. But the air between teacher and student remained heavy. It wasn't until the final bell rang, marking the end of the school day, that Mrs. Walker found her opportunity. As students packed their bags and streamed out of the room, she called out, "Sophia, could you stay for a moment?" Sophia paused, her hand hovering over her backpack. She glanced at Mrs. Walker, her face unreadable. Before nodding, she sat back down, her posture straight and composed, though a flicker of apprehension crossed her eyes. Mrs. Walker approached her slowly, pulling out a chair and sitting down beside her. For a moment, the older woman said nothing, her hands resting on the desk as she gathered her thoughts. Sophia watched her cautiously, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of her notebook. "Sophia," Mrs. Walker began, her voice softer than Sophia had ever heard it. "I want to apologize." Sophia blinked, the words catching her off guard. "Apologize," she echoed, her tone laced with surprise. Mrs. Walker nodded, her gaze steady. "Yes. I've been unfair to you. I let my own insecurities cloud my judgment. And in doing so, I disrespected your efforts and your talent. That wasn't right." Sophia stared at her teacher, unsure how to respond. She had spent weeks bracing herself for more challenges, more subtle digs at her abilities. An apology was the last thing she had expected. "You don't need to apologize," Sophia said quietly, though her voice trembled slightly. "I just wanted to learn. That's all." Mrs. Walker's expression softened further. "And you've done more than that. You've reminded me what teaching is truly about. It's not just about transferring knowledge, it's about fostering it, encouraging it. I lost sight of that, and you helped me see it again." For the first time, Sophia saw something vulnerable in Mrs. Walker's eyes, a glimpse of the person behind the stern exterior. It was disarming, and it made her feel something she hadn't expected: empathy. "My home isn't always easy," Sophia admitted hesitantly, her fingers tightening around her notebook. "Math is the only thing that makes sense to me. It's where I can feel like I'm in control." Mrs. Walker's heart ached at the girl's honesty. She had suspected that Sophia carried more than most children her age. But hearing it spoken aloud made the burden feel tangible. "I'm sorry you've had to carry so much, Sophia," she said, her voice heavy with sincerity. "But I want you to know that I see your strength. You are extraordinary not just because of your intelligence, but because of your resilience." Sophia looked down, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Thank you," she said softly. It was all she could manage, but it carried the weight of her gratitude. From that day forward, something shifted between them. Mrs. Walker no longer saw Sophia as a challenge to her authority but as a student with boundless potential. And Sophia, in turn, began to see Mrs. Walker not as an adversary but as an ally. Though the classroom was the same, the atmosphere felt different. Mrs. Walker made an effort to nurture Sophia's talent, often staying after school to help her explore advanced concepts. Their relationship became one of mutual respect, a bond that would quietly shape the course of both their lives. In the quiet moments of her room, Sophia still whispered promises to herself. But now, those promises felt less like distant dreams and more like inevitable realities. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was growing. And for the first time, she felt like someone else believed in her too. The months following Mrs. Walker's apology marked a turning point for Sophia. The tension that had once filled the classroom dissipated, replaced by a sense of quiet encouragement. Mrs. Walker had not only acknowledged Sophia's brilliance but had become her fiercest advocate. Their relationship, once strained, transformed into a partnership built on mutual respect and a shared goal, to unlock Sophia's full potential. One afternoon, as the last bell rang and students began packing up, Mrs. Walker called Sophia to her desk. The classroom was nearly empty, the chatter of students fading into the hallway. "Sophia," Mrs. Walker began, her tone serious but warm, "have you ever heard of the National Mathematics Competition?" Sophia shook her head. "No. What is it?" Mrs. Walker pulled a brochure from her desk and handed it to Sophia. The cover was sleek and professional, emblazoned with the words National Mathematics Competition, Unlocking Young Minds. The pages inside described a prestigious annual event designed to identify and reward exceptional talent in mathematics. Winners received scholarships to top schools and opportunities to connect with influential educators and mathematicians. "This competition could be a game changer for you," Mrs. Walker said, leaning forward. "You have the talent, Sophia. I know you do. But it won't be easy. The problems are challenging. And the best students in the country will be competing. Are you willing to try?" Sophia stared at the brochure, her heart racing. It was an incredible opportunity, one that could open doors she hadn't even known existed. But the weight of self-doubt pressed against her chest. "What if I'm not good enough?" she asked quietly, her voice trembling with uncertainty. Mrs. Walker smiled gently. "Sophia, you've already shown me and yourself what you're capable of. This isn't just about winning. It's about pushing yourself, about seeing how far you can go. I'll be with you every step of the way." Sophia nodded slowly, the seed of determination beginning to take root. "Okay," she said, her voice steadying. "I'll try." From that day forward, their afternoons were dedicated to preparation. Mrs. Walker stayed late after school, crafting complex problems and guiding Sophia through advanced mathematical concepts that far exceeded the school's curriculum. Sophia threw herself into the work with unrelenting focus, her notebook filling with equations and solutions. Each solved problem was a small victory, a step closer to proving to herself that she belonged on the national stage. The competition day arrived faster than Sophia anticipated. The venue was nothing like the familiar classrooms of Springfield Elementary. It was a sprawling conference hall in Chicago, filled with rows of desks and a palpable buzz of nervous energy. Students from all over the country, each dressed sharply and carrying an air of quiet confidence, filled the room. Sophia, clutching her worn-out notebook, felt like an outsider. Mrs. Walker placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You've got this," she said firmly. "Just focus on the problems. One at a time. Like we've practiced." Sophia nodded, taking a deep breath as she entered the hall and found her assigned seat. The proctor's voice echoed through the room, announcing the start of the competition. Papers were distributed, and Sophia's heart raced as she flipped hers over. The problems were daunting, far more complex than anything she had encountered before. For a moment, panic threatened to overtake her, but then she remembered Mrs. Walker's words. Steady and reassuring. One problem at a time. With renewed focus, Sophia began. The hours passed in a blur. Sophia's pencil moved steadily, her mind weaving through the intricate web of equations and logical puzzles. Each solution felt like a small triumph, a reminder of the countless hours she had spent preparing. By the time the proctor called time, Sophia was exhausted but satisfied. She had given it her all. As the judges deliberated, Sophia waited nervously with the other students in a separate room. Some chatted animatedly, their confidence evident, while others sat quietly, their expressions mirroring her own. When her name was called, she froze. "Sophia Carter," the voice announced. "First place." The room erupted into applause, but the sound barely registered. Sophia's mind struggled to process the words. She looked toward the doorway, where Mrs. Walker stood, her face lit with pride and her eyes glistening with unshed tears. In that moment, everything felt surreal. Sophia walked onto the stage to receive her trophy, her hands trembling as she held it high. The applause swelled around her, but her focus remained on Mrs. Walker. Her teacher's unwavering belief in her had brought her to this moment. On the drive home, the weight of what she had achieved began to sink in. The scholarship she had won would allow her to attend one of the best schools in the country, a private academy in Chicago with resources far beyond what she had known in Springfield. It was a chance to leave behind the chaos of her home and immerse herself in a world of opportunity. As they pulled into her driveway, Sophia turned to Mrs. Walker. "I couldn't have done this without you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. Mrs. Walker shook her head, smiling. "You've always had it in you, Sophia. I just helped you see it." That night, as Sophia lay in bed, the trophy resting on her desk, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known before. She had faced her fears, embraced her potential, and taken the first step toward the life she had always dreamed of. For the first time, she felt truly free. Sophia's transition to the prestigious private academy in Chicago was both exhilarating and daunting. The school was unlike anything she had ever seen, grand hallways lined with polished wood, classrooms equipped with cutting-edge technology, and teachers who spoke with the authority of experts in their fields. It was a world away from Springfield, where resources were limited and ambition often felt out of reach. Here, it seemed like the possibilities were endless. But so were the challenges. Her first few weeks were overwhelming. The coursework was advanced, far more rigorous than anything she had faced before, and many of her classmates had grown up in environments that fostered their intellect from a young age. They spoke confidently, their polished accents carrying the weight of privilege and opportunity. Sophia, with her thrift store backpack and weathered notebooks, felt out of place. Yet, she reminded herself why she was there. This school was her bridge to a better future. Sophia threw herself into her studies, her determination outweighing her insecurities. She spent long hours in the library, poring over textbooks and practicing equations late into the night. The familiar rhythm of problem-solving calmed her, reminding her of the sanctuary she had found in math as a child. Slowly, she began to find her footing. Her teachers quickly took notice. Sophia's brilliance wasn't just in her ability to solve complex problems but in the way she approached them. She saw numbers as puzzles, each one holding a secret waiting to be uncovered. Her insights often left even her instructors impressed. During a particularly challenging physics class, she was the only student who managed to answer a question about advanced kinematics. Her teacher paused. Then smiled. "You've got quite the mind, Sophia," he said. "Don't ever doubt that." Despite her academic successes, social integration was more difficult. Many of her peers came from affluent families, their conversations peppered with stories of lavish vacations and exclusive summer programs. Sophia often felt like an outsider, unsure how to bridge the gap between their world and hers. But her authenticity and kindness began to resonate with a few of her classmates. One of them was a girl named Emma, who initially seemed aloof but approached Sophia after a group project. "You're incredible at math," Emma said, her tone more curious than envious. "Want to study together sometime?" It was a small gesture, but it marked the beginning of a friendship that helped Sophia feel less alone. As the months turned into years, Sophia flourished. She joined the school's math and science clubs, often leading projects that pushed the boundaries of creativity and logic. She entered and won several local and state competitions, earning a reputation as one of the brightest minds at the academy. But her aspirations extended beyond personal achievement. Sophia's experiences had shaped her into someone deeply empathetic. She couldn't ignore the disparity between her current environment and the struggles she had left behind in Springfield. The other children she had grown up with hadn't been given the same opportunities, and she knew that brilliance often went unrecognized in places where chaos overshadowed potential. Sophia wanted to change that. By the time she graduated from the academy, she had already begun laying the groundwork for her future. Accepted into one of the top universities in the country, she majored in mathematics and education, determined to use her skills to create opportunities for others. The seed of an idea began to grow, a program that would identify and support gifted children from underprivileged backgrounds, providing them with the resources and mentorship they needed to succeed. After years of hard work, that idea became a reality. Sophia founded Pathway to Success, an initiative designed to bridge the gap for talented but underprivileged students. The program offered free tutoring, access to advanced resources, and mentorship from professionals across various fields. What set it apart was its personal touch. Sophia ensured that every participant felt seen and valued, just as Mrs. Walker had made her feel. The program quickly gained recognition, attracting partnerships from educational institutions and philanthropists. Newspapers hailed Sophia as a visionary in education, but she remained humble, deflecting the praise onto the children whose lives were being transformed. "They're the real stars," she often said. "I'm just giving them the tools." At one of the program's milestones, the enrollment of its 1,000th student, Sophia gave a speech that left the audience deeply moved. "When I was a child," she began, her voice steady but filled with emotion, "I didn't know if I could change my reality. But one thing was always clear to me: knowledge was my best chance. Today, I want to provide that same opportunity to every child who dreams of a better future." Her words resonated, not just because of their sincerity but because they came from someone who had lived the struggle. For Sophia, Pathway to Success wasn't just a program, it was a reflection of her journey, a way to honor the people and moments that had shaped her life. Though her schedule was demanding, Sophia remained deeply involved in the program. She often met with students, mentoring them and listening to their stories. One boy, an 8-year-old named Ethan who excelled in science, once asked her, "How did you make it out?" Sophia smiled at him, remembering the shy girl she had once been. "With a lot of effort," she replied gently. "And because I had people who believed in me. Now it's your turn to believe." Even with all her success, Sophia never forgot her roots. She often visited Springfield, walking the quiet streets of her childhood and reflecting on how far she had come. Each visit reminded her of the strength it had taken to rise above her circumstances and the importance of creating pathways for others to do the same. Her vision was clear, her purpose unwavering. Sophia had built more than a career, she had built a legacy. And though her journey was far from over, she knew one thing for certain: her story was just the beginning of countless others. The impact of Pathway to Success continued to grow. reaching communities far beyond what Sophia had initially imagined. Each new enrollment brought fresh opportunities for children to access the tools they needed to thrive. Sophia remained at the heart of the program, tirelessly advocating for her students and ensuring the initiative stayed true to its mission. She had built something extraordinary, but she knew it wouldn't have been possible without the people who had shaped her journey. It was during the celebration of Pathway to Success's 1.000th student enrollment that an unexpected reunion took place. The event was held in a grand auditorium, the air buzzing with excitement. The audience included former program graduates, mentors, donors, and community leaders. As Sophia prepared to take the stage, her mind was focused on delivering a speech that would inspire those gathered to continue supporting her vision. She stepped onto the stage with her characteristic grace, her sleek blazer perfectly tailored, and her voice steady. "When I started this program," she began, "it was inspired by a simple truth: talent exists everywhere, but opportunity does not. I stand here today because someone believed in me when I didn't fully believe in myself. And because of that, I was able to dream bigger than I ever thought possible." Her eyes scanned the crowd, and then she froze. Near the back of the room, sitting quietly, was a face she hadn't seen in years: Mrs. Walker. The woman who had once been her greatest challenge and later her fiercest advocate sat with her hands clasped, her expression a mixture of pride and nostalgia. Sophia's voice faltered for a moment, but she quickly regained her composure. She continued her speech, weaving in stories of the program's success and the resilience of the students it served. Yet her thoughts lingered on Mrs. Walker. After the applause died down and the guests began mingling, Sophia made her way to the back of the room. "Miss Walker," she said softly, her voice carrying a warmth that hadn't faded over the years. Mrs. Walker stood, her eyes shining. "Sophia," she replied, her voice thick with emotion, "you've done something extraordinary. I wouldn't have missed this for the world." The two women embraced, and for a moment, the years melted away. They spoke quietly, catching up on the moments and milestones that had shaped their lives since they last saw each other. Mrs. Walker, now retired, shared how she had followed Sophia's progress from a distance, her pride growing with every article or accolade she read. "I always knew you were destined for great things," Mrs. Walker said. "But seeing it like this, it's overwhelming." Sophia smiled, the sincerity of her gratitude evident. "I wouldn't be here without you. You challenged me in ways I didn't understand at the time, but it made me stronger. And when I needed it most, you believed in me." Their conversation was interrupted briefly by the event's host, who asked Sophia to introduce Mrs. Walker to the audience. Hand in hand, they walked to the stage, the room quieting as they stood together. "I'd like everyone to meet someone who played a pivotal role in my life," Sophia said, her voice steady but laced with emotion. "This is Mrs. Walker, my teacher, my mentor, and one of the first people who taught me to believe in myself." The audience erupted into applause, and Mrs. Walker, though unused to the spotlight, stepped forward to speak. "I may have been Sophia's teacher," she began, "but the truth is, I learned more from her than she ever did from me. She taught me that believing in someone's potential can change their life and your own. And that's a lesson I'll carry with me forever." The applause grew louder. But for Sophia and Mrs. Walker, it was more than a public celebration. It was a moment of closure, an acknowledgement of the journey they had shared and the profound impact they had had on each other's lives. After the event, they sat together in a quiet corner, reminiscing about the classroom where it had all begun. Mrs. Walker shared stories of her early struggles as a teacher, admitting that her initial harshness had stemmed from her own insecurities. "I was so afraid of failing my students," she confessed. "And then you came along. So bright, so determined. You reminded me why I became a teacher in the first place." Sophia reached out, placing her hand over Mrs. Walker's. "And you reminded me that even when things feel impossible, there's always someone willing to help you find your way." The reunion marked the beginning of a new chapter in their relationship. Mrs. Walker became involved in Pathway to Success, mentoring young teachers and helping to shape the program's approach to education. Her experience and wisdom became invaluable, and she found a renewed sense of purpose in guiding others. For Sophia, the reunion deepened her commitment to the program. Every day, she saw pieces of herself in the students she worked with, the quiet resilience, the hunger for knowledge, the dreams that felt just out of reach. She made it her mission to ensure that no child would be left behind simply because they lacked resources or encouragement. Years later, as Sophia stood in the program's newly opened national headquarters, she reflected on how far she had come. The walls were lined with photos of students who had gone on to achieve incredible things: engineers, doctors, artists, and educators. Each face represented a story, a life changed because of the bridges she and her team had built. Sophia knew her work was far from over. There were always more children to reach, more barriers to break. But as she held an old notebook in her hands, its pages filled with equations from her childhood, she felt a deep sense of fulfillment. She had turned her struggles into strength, her dreams into reality, and now, she was helping others do the same. As she looked out the window at the bustling city below, she whispered the words that had carried her through every challenge: "I will be more than this." And she was. She was a dreamer, a door, and a builder of futures. As Sophia stood before the crowd at Pathway to Success's annual celebration, she reflected on the journey that had brought her here. From a young girl solving math problems in a cramped room in Springfield to a leader transforming lives across the country, her path had been anything but easy. But every challenge, every tear, and every late-night study session had been worth it. Looking into the eyes of the students seated before her, she saw hope for a better future, for opportunities they might not have imagined possible. She smiled, holding back her own tears. "If there's one thing I've learned," she said, her voice steady but emotional, "it's that our circumstances don't define us. What defines us is our belief in what we can achieve, and the people who remind us we're capable of greatness." The applause that followed was thunderous, but Sophia remained humble. For her, this wasn't the end of a journey but the beginning of countless others. Thank you for watching this inspiring tale of resilience and transformation. Subscribe to Life Stories to follow more incredible journeys that remind us of the power of dreams and determination. See you in the next story.